Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, on our 1-year anniversary, we again delve into some of the excellent questions that you've kindly sent us over the last year and offer our unscripted take on various Great War-related topics. Well, hi Dan, a pleasure to be joining you on a really special episode because this is episode number 52 of the series. It's numbered number 50, but we have two bonus episodes, our Christmas special, if you will, and also our Both Sides of the Wire crossover. So this represents our 52nd episode. We release an episode a week. And so that means, Dan, there's been a year of Not So Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah, how time flies, eh, Spence? But I've got to say, what great fun it's been as well. You know, to just sit here and have a chat with you about Great War history is fun, but to do so with an audience and such an engaged audience as well is a real privilege. So, you know, I think amongst other things, just really want to thank everybody else that has joined in, engaged with us in any way, shape or form over the last year, or perhaps hasn't, but just enjoyed the content. You know, thanks very much for coming along and joining us. It's been quite a journey, and I'm really looking forward to what the next year has in store. But before we do that, of course, you guys listening in, you hear two of us, but the truth is, Spence, there's not two of us doing this project. There's three of us doing it.
There is, and the third man who's never seen, but believe me, his influence is always felt, is Linus, who is our producer, who's done fantastic work with this podcast over the years. The sound quality that you get to enjoy, listeners, it's largely down to Linus's unsung work. And although he appears in the show notes, about time he got a proper mention on this show. So thank you to Linus. And just to echo as well, Dan, thank you to the audience, because one thing I think is really important is to know that we do reach an audience. And yes, we can see our listener statistics. We see those. What I think has made recording this podcast very special, at least for me, is the feedback and the response that we've had. Even if you were writing to sometimes criticize us for some reason or another, the amount of feedback we've had. Every email we read, every comment we read, we really try and absorb what you say. And I can tell you, listeners, that there's a sort of special pleasure to sometimes just see a comment on a podcast episode, even perhaps one we recorded 6 months ago, where a listener has said, I really enjoyed this. It really does make it feel special. And I have to say, Dan, it almost feels, given the level of correspondence we receive, that it's almost like a community. And I certainly want to thank everybody who's listened, everybody who's written in, and everybody who continues to listen.
Yeah, very much so. Just entirely agree with what you say there. You know, to know that we're not shouting into the void, but rather there are people at the other end listening is fantastic. And, you know, with that in mind, we thought we've previously done this before and actually had really great feedback on it. So we thought, why not celebrate? Commemorate's probably not the right word, actually, is it? That proves that we do too much First World War commemoration stuff. To celebrate the 1-year anniversary, why not answer a few more of your excellent questions that have come in? And let's get stuck straight into it, Spence, because there's plenty to choose from. I don't know how far through this will get, but of course we can always come back in the future and visit. But there's a couple of interesting ones. Anything you want to pick out to start off with?
I do, and listeners, one thing to really stress is this has not been scripted, so to speak. This is just like our previous listeners' questions episode. We are putting each other a little bit on the spot, but I think the fact we have so many questions is just testament to how many great ideas get sent in. And I'm just going to pick one here for you, Dan, sent in by Cousin Gary. Not my cousin, I hasten to add, but Cousin Gary asks a really interesting question, and that's, did the BEF use dog tags in World War I?
That is a good question. Actually, if we take away the slight misnomer of the phrase dog tags, which is really an Americanism and really popularized during the Second World War, you could ask the question, did the BEF use identity discs? And I think the answer there is yes. And actually, it's a slightly complex answer and actually a really interesting one if you look at the kind of story of the evolution of the British Army during that time period. So officially, as of about 1907, there was a disc which was mandated by the British Army High Command, who said all soldiers in the British Army should carry some form of disc. This is typically an aluminium disc, but it was issued in a bit of a haphazard way. So regimental level originally, not everybody got one. Some people got ones with different information on. Importantly, sometimes they were worn in different locations depending on the regiment. Now, when you're scrambling about trying to find an identity disc that you don't know exactly where it's going to be on a body, actually can lead to quite a few problems. So, really, there's a lack of uniformity. And importantly, at that time, there's only one disc. This is a really big problem when it comes to commemorating and actually trying to identify casualties. Because let's say you go out into no man's land in 1914, you find Private Smith who's been killed out there. What do you do? Do you take the information off his disc or do you take his disc away? Well, if you take his disc away, chances are the next person that comes along doesn't find any identification on Private Smith. And perhaps you don't have a chance to go back there. Perhaps something happens in which that body then gets disassociated from the disc permanently. All of a sudden, Private Smith might just be an unknown private. And so the British Army recognises this quite quickly. And by 1915, they introduce what we see right through to the Second World War, actually, which is a pair of discs. And Americans are going to use it, and all modern armies are going to use it to this day. And the idea here is that, at first, at least with the British, it's a compressed fibre disc, and there are two of them. So one of them is an octagonal shape, a green one, which is worn kind of as a lanyard and mandated to be worn around the neck, which is very important. And the second one is suspended from that, and it's a red circular disc. They're duplicated in information, so the same info is put on there. Importantly, religion is put on there, which is a big deal for burial practices. And the idea being, if you now find Private Smith and you find, of course, that he's been killed, what you do is you take away the red circular disc. You leave the green one on the body, so his identity remains with the body. Also, if somebody else comes along 2 minutes later and they find that the red disc has been removed, they know that somebody has already found him and they're in the process of reporting his loss. So it's a really big deal, actually. It makes quite a difference in terms of the number of fallen who were identified. The problem that we get these days is that compressed fibre doesn't last very well, particularly in watery conditions. And therefore, if you find a body out in the fields today, that fibre disc no longer exists. What you also get, just to throw on top of that, is unofficial discs of various different kinds. And these have gone on for much longer than much pre 1907, we should say. And this might be a bracelet. It might be something that an officer gets as a private purchase, usually silver or some durable metal, which is going to contain that personal information, often worn as a bracelet around the wrist. So men in different phases of the war will have different levels of identity disc. But it's fascinating to think of. And of course, that major problem of just huge numbers of casualties really gives birth to this idea of a dual disc, ideally in metal, as we see today, which is much more hard wearing and can increase the chances, we should say, of a fallen soldier remaining identified.
Really interesting answer, and I learned a lot from that, Dan. I'm glad you actually handled that question, because if it had come to me, I'd have probably just said, Dan, what do you think about that? So this is why we work as a duo on this show, but really, really interesting information. And I'd like to just ask you another question from our list, because in a way it relates to the finding of bodies, and it relates to the burial of bodies in particular, which we've covered. And this actually is from an anonymous account, but it's an evocative question, and I'd certainly be interested in your thoughts. And this is, do you think that those executed should be entitled to a Commonwealth war grave?
Wow. That's a tricky question. Actually, one I've kind of thrown about on many battlefield tours that I've led over the years. And truthfully, I'm not sure I've got an absolutely nailed on answer. But there are a couple of things I think which are worth mentioning here. One of them, I think, depending on the way you look at it. So let's say somebody's executed for desertion or cowardice during the Great War. Their punishment is mandated, of course, as execution. And you could argue, and I think there's a strong argument here, and it works in civilian life as well, that at the point that punishment is carried out, that person is, for lack of a better phrase, square with the house again. Their debt has been paid. And therefore, they've paid their dues, which in this case would be their life. And as a result, they are entitled to a headstone. And I can see it from that point of view. I definitely can. The other thing to bear in mind, though, is that, if you walk into any Commonwealth War Graves cemetery anywhere in the world today, and, you might look at Private Smith, who's been killed in action, and you might see next to him Private Jones. What you wouldn't know is that maybe Private Jones has been executed for desertion, cowardice, murder, any number of crimes. but they carry exactly the same headstone. There's no identifying marker with them. They're not buried in a separate location like you find in US cemeteries, particularly First World War US cemeteries. They have a plot typically where you get some shot at dawn. Famously, there's one, I think, in the Meuse Argonne, which actually covers Second World War executions. So I don't know. I don't know how I feel about a soldier being killed in action being buried next to somebody that's maybe deserted their comrades 7 times. And I'm not sure how the soldiers of the time would have felt either. But there's one story that sticks in my mind. It's an area that I love to go to. It's actually Bethune, so northern France. So it's kind of the 1915 battlefields around Festubert, Neuchâtel, that area. And in, I think from memory, January 1915, there were two privates. It was Private Price and Morgan of the 2nd Welsh Regiment. They actually shot their CSM whilst drunk. So behind the lines, I think you're in Bethune town itself. They shot a guy called CSM Hayes whilst drunk. Both of them put on trial. Both of them are executed for murder. And all 3 men, including the CSM, are today buried in the same cemetery. Now, if you consider that and say, okay, well, what about if CSM Hughes' wife wants to go out and visit her husband's grave, who fights, as far as we know, very well, and is murdered effectively? She's got to walk past the headstones of the 2 men that murdered him. That's a really difficult one to kind of to get my head around, and I don't know. There's more to the story because there's a suggestion of serious bullying, which of course wouldn't be out of place in the British Army. Let's face it, at that time particularly. So there's a lot of nuances in there, and I'm going to sidestep the question, Spencer. Say I'm not sure. How about you? What do you think?
I think it's a very difficult issue, and a lot of it really speaks to the civil approach to actually execution victims in British civil society, because this was actually a long-running debate that really ran through the late 1800s into the early 1900s about, at the moment of your death, are your sins, are your crimes absolved? And that was actually something that was quite a major debate in civil society. The church was involved, prison reformers were involved, and this debate really then plugged into the First World War as well. The idea that once you had been executed, your crimes had been paid, and you were still entitled to be buried as a soldier. And there's other sort of aspects to this as well that connect to it. The idea that if you were a Victoria Cross holder and you happened, I don't think this ever happened, but if you happened to be executed for murder, you could go to the gallows as a Victoria Cross holder. And you wouldn't be stripped of your medal, you would retain it. And so there's a much more complex civil society issue at the time than I think we remember. We can just look at it through the eyes of the 21st century, and our eyes are very different. Our approach to prison, our approach to crime and punishment, our approach to execution is different, especially in Britain, than it was 110 years ago. And if we look at it in the context of the time, the idea of burying your executed soldiers alongside soldiers who died in battle was not as controversial then as it probably is now. And that's where I think it's really important to remember the wider history, that the First World War doesn't happen in a vacuum. Civil society is heavily involved in this. And at the time, I can't swear to this, I'm on the spot, but at the time I suspect that this was considered quite a liberal move, a caring move, that yes, you've been executed, but you won't be put in an unmarked grave, or what was called in the time a pauper's grave. You are still entitled to a Commonwealth War Graves headstone, because even though you might have deserted 10 times and then been executed, you still served as a soldier. And so at the time, this was probably seen very differently to how we would see it now as we look back. But I think that tells us a little bit about how the war is it's really important to look at it in a very broad sense. It's very easy to just myopically focus on one or two issues. I think we all do it. But remember, it's also taking place in a big, busy, involved civil society. And at the time, just to emphasize this, probably not as controversial as we see it now.
Yeah, just another thing as you were talking there that's kind of sprung to mind. And again, I don't know whether this is absolutely the case, but from memory, those executed in civilian life and various other locations, including in places like the Peninsular War, would not be allowed to be buried in consecrated grounds, so particularly strong within the Catholic faith. I don't know whether that applies to the First World War. Actually, it'd be really interesting to have a look at, and if anybody's got any further lead on this, it'd be fascinating to kind of add to this conversation, because from memory, Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries are consecrated, but We'd have to check that, and it would be intriguing to know because that would, of course, break from that convention of saying, well, if you're executed, you can't be buried within consecrated ground. I don't know, Spence. Any idea on that one?
I have no idea at all, but listeners, if you've got some insight into this, if we have any experts in the history of the church and so forth, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. This is a little bit beyond our level of expertise.
Yeah, very true. I'm going to chuck in a question that you absolutely haven't seen, Spence, because it's just arrived on my WhatsApp about a minute ago. So I'm going to see if you know this one, because I don't know the answer. I think I've got a hunch about it. So the question is from my friend Paul Pardew over in the States, who says, financing the war, is the UK still paying its war debts? And to what percentage, what kind of GDP level are we talking when it was paying, if that was the case?
It is no longer paying its war debts. It's no longer paying war debts from the First or the Second World War. I stand to be corrected on the exact dates, but I believe the First World War debt was paid off by the 1990s, and the Second World War debt was paid off sometime around 2010 or 2011. And what's interesting about the debts, particularly from the First World War, is it's impossible to put a figure on them in terms of how they're being paid because of this confusing situation that occurs really in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, which is sometimes referred to in British press of the day as the debt prison or the debt cage. And to summarize very, very simply, because this is not an economics podcast, the big problem is everybody owes somebody some money and nobody can unlock that money. And to put it in simple terms, Germany is being charged for the war. The war reparations are designed to make good the debts that the Allied powers have developed. So Germany is meant to pay France. And France, of course, wants a lot of money. A large portion of France has been devastated. And France has borrowed an enormous amount of money from primarily Britain and to a lesser extent America. Britain wants the money from France. It wants to be paid back its own debts. France can't pay its debts to Britain because France can't get any money from Germany. Meanwhile, America has heavily financed Britain, especially really throughout the war, but especially from 1917 onwards. America wants the money from Britain, but Britain can't pay America the money because it's waiting for the money from France. And France can't pay Britain because it's waiting for the money from Germany, and Germany has no money. And it creates a credit crisis in Europe that really dogs Europe for the entire 1920s. There's no roaring 20s in Europe. And perversely, and I'm simplifying greatly here, there's a lot of other factors, but it contributes to a huge credit bubble in the United States because on paper, a lot of United States financial institutions have got really, really promising balance sheets where they're owed staggering amounts of money, and that allows them to generate almost limitless credit. But the problem with having a debt or somebody having a debt to you is that debt is useless unless it can be serviced. And the problem is Europe cannot service its debts. And adding to the complexity, Imperial Russia has borrowed lots and lots of money from Britain. And when the Soviet Union emerges in the rubble of Imperial Russia, the Soviets say, well, we don't recognize any of these debts. We're not paying you a penny back. And Britain just has to eat it. It's nothing it can do, which damages its own ability to pay back. So you get these really terrible sort of unbalanced scales. In Europe, you can't raise credit because everybody is in debt. And in America, there's too much credit, which is leading to rampant speculation, which is creating a vast economic bubble. People at the time are aware of this, and there are two pretty earnest attempts to try and rebalance the payments in Europe. And ironically, and this is disputed by historians, the final version of this, which I believe from memory is called the Young Plan, which is a restructuring of German debts, a reduction of German war reparations to try and encourage them to start paying and loosen up the credit situation in Europe. That's brought in about May 1929, again from memory here. And ironically, that may have actually tipped the scales or contributed to the tipping of the scales because the acknowledgement, late as it was, over in the United States, well, hold on a minute, we've done the maths. Germany is not going to pay as much money as we first thought, which means France isn't going to get enough money, Britain isn't going to get enough money. That means our debts might not be serviceable, may have contributed, and economists argue about this, it may have contributed significantly to the Wall Street crash, which occurs, of course, in the latter half of 1929, which then creates the Great Depression. And so in that sense, nobody's paying any debts to anybody in the 1930s. And Britain's First World War debt, as I understand it, and again, I'm not an economist, it's separate from the Second World War debt, and it's paid off alongside the Second World War debt, but separately to it. And eventually it's paid off in the 1990s, I believe. But anybody who's a financial expert or an economist or an economic historian, I stand to be corrected on that, because this is purely from memory.
Got to say, mate, that was pretty damn impressive, though. Even if it's not correct, that was quite good. So. Excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to move on to a much simpler question. But I'm going to throw it straight back to you, though, because I think it's an interesting one, and I'm sure everybody's got their own opinion here. We've got Turnbull AC via Twitter who asks, if you were forced to pick, who is the best general of either side in the First World War?
Gosh, that's a very difficult question. Turnbull AC as well. I wonder if that's a reference to the cult 1970s movie, The Warriors. I'm stalling for time while I come up with this. Best First World War general. Well, I'm going to add a little historian's wrinkle to this and say that I think there's two real types of general in the First World War. There's the big strategic thinkers, the strategists, who are generally back in the capital cities. And then there's the battlefield commanders who are actually trying to organize things and trying to move things around. And I'm going to make a case that the best British general is one of those strategists. And I think that's William Robertson, the only man to ever rise from private to field marshal in the history of the British Army. Remarkable rise. His mother didn't want him to join the army at all, didn't think it was a proper profession for a young man. He managed to turn this, despite having a distinct working class accent. Through his sheer ability, he climbed all the way to field marshal and become chief of the Imperial General Staff. And he's the quartermaster of the BEF in 1914 and does extremely well handling its supplies. He becomes chief of staff to the BEF in 1915 and does his best with very, very difficult circumstances. He's the chief of the Imperial General Staff through 16, 17 and into early 18. And he really reorganizes the way Britain is going to fight strategically. He brings a real strategic ruthlessness to how this is going to be prosecuted. He's very against sideshows, and he's very much of the opinion that the only way to win the war is on the Western Front, that Germany's allies, as formidable as they may be individually, will all fall if Germany falls. And he's probably correct in that. And he works extremely hard to try and master the strategic elements of the Western Front. The tragedy, in a way, for Robertson is he's also trying to influence how the BEF fights. And he's very much in favor of a step-by-step approach, relatively cautious offensives, bite off a piece of the German front line, consolidate it, pause, and go forward, which will really become the preferred method of a number of BEF generals by the end of the war. But he's also caught in this political battle because on one hand, he wants to support the army. He's army through and through, and he's very suspicious of Britain's politicians. So he feels he has to support the army at all costs. But on the other hand, Douglas Haig, who is commanding the army in France on the Western Front, Douglas Haig doesn't want to hear anything about bite and hold. He's not interested in that. He's a breakthrough general. And so Robertson keeps writing these letters to Haig saying, I really think it's a good idea, you should do this. I think this is the way we should fight on the Western Front. And Haig, they just go whoosh straight over Haig's head. He's not interested in them, doesn't care. And Robertson gets caught in this really difficult vice, I think, because on one hand, I think he gets quite frustrated with Haig by the end of 1917. But on the other hand, he's even more frustrated with the politicians. He doesn't trust British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. And so Robertson doesn't feel that he can come out against Haig. He has to support Haig at all costs, even though he doesn't agree with the way Haig is fighting the battle. And in the end, Robertson is a pretty disappointed figure. He gets replaced in early 1918, and he's pretty downhearted and pessimistic. He goes on to write a very interesting book about civil-military relations called Soldiers and Statesmen, which is published some years later. It's difficult to get hold of. It's out of print. But I think that's a great reflection about the difficulties of being a soldier and not only trying to fight a war, but also deal with complex political machinery in Britain. And I'm going to say his strategy ultimately is correct. And he helps to reorganize the British and by extension, British Empire's war effort in a very, very effective way. So as a top strategist, I'm going to say I think William Robertson is the finest general of the First World War. And now I'm going to bowl straight down the other end at you, Dan, and say, who's your pick?
Well, I'm gonna go for somebody who Robertson actually has the distinct, very famously fires in 1915 with the words "Oris, you're for Rome" in his fine Cockney accent that he delivers. That is going to be a Horace Lockwood Smith Dorrien, who I'm going to come back to in a minute, because I think, given the fact we've got a very high proportion of Canadian and Australian audience, I think we need to make two honourable mentions here. And I think the two imperial elephants in the room at the time are going to be Generals Currie and Monash of the Canadian and Australian forces, respectively. Both of whom, without doubt, are very capable generals. Neither of whom are faultless, but Monash in particular, when finally those puzzle pieces which are going to unlock the conundrum of the Western Front are placed together, there's a very strong argument to say that Monash has the first crack at it and is the first one to really get it right in a big, meaningful way at the Battle of Le Hamel in 1918. He's also, we should add, a disciple of General Plumer, who does some really outstanding work as well in terms of preparation prior to an attack, really being a detail man and trying to keep casualties down whilst making maximum effect. I think Monash, Currie, Plumer, all of whom are very capable in what they achieve at Messines, Le Hamel, and then various different Canadian actions in 1918. But I want to go back to a fairly unpopular character, really late war at least, and that's going to be General Smith Dorrien, who's one of the two corps commanders when the BEF goes out to France in 1914, famously replacing a general who dies on a train due to pretty unhealthy conditions he's forced himself into by eating too much for the 20 or 30 years prior to that, whose name's escaping me at the moment, begins with a G. Grierson. So Smith Dorrien comes out and he's really fighting a couple of different wars. One of them is, of course, against the enemy. Another one is against two guys that really don't like him very much, including his direct superior, General French, with whom he's fallen out for some unknown and slightly murky reason in the years prior to the war. But I think if you were to place the scales for the BEF, at least, on moments that could have been absolutely catastrophic had a bold decision not been made, I think you've got to give Smith Dorrien a lot of credit here. This is a guy that started his career at the disaster during the Battle of Isandlwana. He's one of the few white officers to escape the field that day when an entire regiment of the 24th is going to be wiped out effectively. More than 1,000 guys killed by a massive Zulu force at Isandlwana. He escapes by jumping into a river, or perhaps being thrown into the river by his stabbed horse, grabs hold of a stray horse's tail and gets dragged across the Buffalo River to safety. He's a very lucky boy to live that day. One of 13 children from Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire. And he goes on, rises through the army, shows some pretty good skill. There's a strong argument, I think, Spence, that he's certainly the equal of, perhaps the superior of Haig in the pre-war years. And his decision, I'm going to put down to one particular spot, Le Cateau, in August of 1914, when he decides that he's going to turn his corps and fight right at the point where they're about to be gobbled up by the enormous First Army. And that decision alone, I think, turning, fighting, delivering a powerful counter blow, which really stops the Germans in their tracks and buys the BEF significant time to disappear off down the road and live to fight another day. That decision and that action alone, I think, puts him up there for one of the greatest, if not one of the greatest generals of the war, at least one of the best in terms of his vision and understanding the kind of key moment in a fight, something Napoleon certainly would have recognised in his top generals. So Smith Dorrien I'm going to go with. He's got a shakier 1915 later on, gets outmanoeuvred really, I think perhaps unfairly. But you know Smith Dorrien very well, Spence. What's your take on him?
I'd have to agree with everything you said, Dan, and I'd add another thing that Napoleon would have recognised in Smith Dorrien, and this is that Smith Dorrien was lucky. And there's that supposed quote of Napoleon that the first thing he asked of any of his generals is, are they lucky? And Smith Dorrien had been lucky to survive Isandlwana. He'd had various instances in his career afterwards where he was definitely a man who was willing to push the boundaries of obedience. He was a very independently minded man. He would make his own command decisions, very much a mission command type commander. And he got away with it every single time, including at one point arguing with Herbert Kitchener in the Boer War, when Kitchener wanted an attack against a very strong Boer position at the Battle of Paardeberg. And Smith-Dorrien just said it's not possible. There's going to be too many casualties. And Kitchener accepted that, actually accepted it. This is a man who doesn't really brook argument, especially when he's younger. And Smith-Dorrien not only gets his superior to accept this, but is then respected as a result of it. And there's certainly an element of luck at Le Cateau. Things go well for the British in some respects, not perfectly, but there's an element of luck there. The Germans don't quite realise how close they are to enveloping the BEF, I don't think. The Germans really fight the battle without a great deal of overall control. It's almost a meeting engagement where the Germans are coming onto the battlefield and attacking whatever they see in front of them, which creates confusion. But the very fact that Smith-Dorrien makes that decision, and he's only arrived in France a few days earlier, this incredibly difficult campaign, chaos all around him. He makes that call. He makes big calls and he gets them right. And that's a rare talent. And it's not all down to luck. He's also got finely tuned soldier's instinct. So I'd absolutely say Smith-Dorrien is a very good choice. And I'd add one more, though I'm not going to dwell on it too long because we've got lots and lots of other questions to cover. And that's Edmund Allenby, who I think has a really interesting First World War. He's around at Le Cateau. He's in charge of the pretty disrupted cavalry division at Le Cateau. Doesn't really involve that much at Le Cateau. Doesn't have the easiest Western Front, culminating at the Battle of Arras, which starts extremely well but ends extremely badly for the British. Boils down to a real mud, blood and horror battle with the highest daily casualty rate of any major battle the British fight in the First World War. Allenby gets sacked effectively. He gets sent away. But he finds redemption out in the Middle East. And although it's tempting, and indeed critics of Allenby did this at the time, tempting to go, well, fighting against the Ottoman Empire was nothing like fighting on the Western Front. That's true, in as far as it goes, but it doesn't mean it was easy to fight the Ottoman Empire. Just ask the soldiers at Gallipoli. Just ask the soldiers at the First or Second Battle of Gaza. Ottoman Empire was a formidable defensive organisation and fought very hard in defence of its territory. And Allenby's skill in handling an army that's basically shrinking, especially in 1918, as more and more of his troops get sent off to deal with the German offensive in the Western Front. He's got this very imperial army. You've got all sorts of things, Brits, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians. You've got the Arab army under Lawrence of Arabia to his east. Very complicated war zone, difficult logistics, and Allenby handles that campaign absolutely superbly. And he does something that is not as easy as his critics would have anybody believe, and that's he completely destroys Ottoman and indeed German forces in front of him by the end of 1918. Gets a huge breakthrough, ends the war in the Middle East. So he is rewarded in his own lifetime, but I think he gets a little bit forgotten because his Western Front experience is not as positive, but he learns from it, he takes those lessons into the Middle East, and he does very well there. So there's another candidate for our finest generals. We could do an entire episode on this, I think, Dan.
That's probably quite a good idea, actually. And of course, you've got to throw into the mix as well, being a great general and then being, for example, personally very brave. And that's a much wider pool. You've got so many characters who show great personal bravery. Maybe aren't necessarily the leading generals on the battlefield, but certainly from a personal courage standpoint are not lacking in any sort of way. And no doubt we'll come back to that in due course. But we need to move on and pick out another question here. And I've got a question here from Ian Appleton via Twitter, who asks, if Germany had invested more heavily in tanks, would it have made a difference to the outcome of the war?
Oh, good question. An interesting question as well, because commentators on both sides of the wire actually thought that they probably would have done. Churchill, Liddell Hart, JFC Fuller all wondered why hadn't the Germans invested more in tanks and what might have been the consequences in 1918 if they had. And one of the things, of course, is Germany is considering tracked vehicles as by 1916-17, but it's thinking about transporters rather than fighting vehicles. And that's because Germany's mainly on the defensive in the West. If it had brought in a crash program of tank construction, which it does at the very end of the war, there's a call for hundreds of tanks. And of course, German industry just cannot produce that. It's overworked and overwhelmed at that stage. But let's say that Germany goes big on tanks at about the same time as the British and the French. So you've got a working German tank arm by 1916 and 17. Would it have made a difference to the outcome of the war? I'm not sure it would. And that's because Germany is, for most of the war, is on the defensive on the Western Front. And tanks, though they can be used defensively, are an offensive weapon. And the Germans use some tanks in the spring offensives, and locally they can have an impact. They can be useful tactically. Obviously, there's not enough to achieve critical mass. Would it have made a difference in 1918? It would. It would probably have made German attacks more effective, but German attacks were already pretty effective, especially in the early spring offensive. This combination of very heavy artillery bombardment, stormtroopers, and then follow-up waves of infantry. My instinct is I don't think it would have made a huge difference. I don't think Germany could have really developed the kind of battlefield experience that the British and the French did with their tanks. I think it would have greatly strained German industry. German industry is under a lot of pressure by 17 and into 18. And if you want to increase production of something, it has to come at the cost of something else. This is one of the devilish games the German economists have to play. If you're going to invest in tanks, which are very, very resource intensive, they're also fuel intensive as well, that's going to drain the German economy. So I don't think tanks would have made a huge difference. And the technology of tanks, although it's developing, I don't think it's going to reach a point by 1918 that Germany can have an advanced enough tank in sufficient numbers to make a real battlefield difference. But I'd like to put a wrinkle on this and say what might have made a difference is not German tanks, but German anti-tank guns. And one of the big mistakes that the German High Command makes in 1916 is they don't immediately call for a dedicated anti-tank gun. Their response to tanks, whether that's British tanks at the Somme or French tanks in the Nivelle offensive, is they're not massively impressed with them. They don't think they're a serious threat. They think they can be dealt with existing weapons, whether that is the so-called K bullets, special armor-piercing bullets that can be issued to machine gunners or snipers, grenade bundles that you can potentially throw on the roof of a tank and knock it out, or more commonly artillery. A tank hit by artillery will be destroyed. The German High Command is pretty relaxed about tanks, really up until late 1917. It's not a problem. We can deal with them with what we have. But as more and more tanks appear, as more and more sophisticated tanks appear, that starts to become a serious problem. And by the 100 days, German divisions are having to put so much of their artillery into the front line in an anti-tank gun role. And these are not dedicated anti-tank guns. These are 77mm field guns, very useful field gun. You dig it in, you use it as an anti-tank gun, and it will knock out a tank if it gets a direct hit on it. But it's not really that mobile. Once it's in position, it can't really move. And that means that any anti-tank guns you seed in your front line, they're pretty much one and done. If the front line is overrun, you can't remove these guns. They can't maneuver on the battlefield at all. And by 100 days, some German divisions are putting as much as 25% of their field artillery into the front line in anti-tank gun roles. And that's really not what they're designed for. It's massively dilutes German artillery firepower for barrages and counter-battery fire and so on. And it really weakens the German defense. So I might say if the Germans had called for a dedicated anti-tank gun in 1916, they might have well got one by the end of 1917. In the actual fact, it wasn't until July 1918 the Germans really called for a dedicated anti-tank gun, and it ends up with Rheinmetall making the 3.7 centimeter attack gun, which is the world's really first dedicated anti-tank gun. And it's actually quite a good design. It's quite small. It's handy. It can be pulled by either a single horse or a team of 4 men. So it's quite mobile, much more mobile than a field gun. You need at least 4 horses for that. It can be partially disassembled, so you can dig it into a position quite easily. So it's difficult to observe. It's small. It can be produced quicker than an artillery piece. So it's got a lot of advantages. It's a pretty sophisticated piece of kit. The problem is, it doesn't actually make it into battle. Some guns might have reached the front line by November. It's not really clear. Probably not. Probably the guns never actually left the training depots. The first guns arriving in October 1918. Maybe some made it to the front in November. There's no evidence any of them ever fired a round in anger. And so they had no effect. But if the Germans had had that anti-tank gun in, say, the spring of 1918 and could have packed their front line with these anti-tank guns in the 100 days, I think that would have made a difference to the war. I think it would have made the fighting even harder. Might not have won the war for Germany, but it would have made the battles of the 100 days look rather different.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I'll just throw in for what it's worth my own thoughts on this. And certainly If the Germans had gone big on tanks, I think it could have made a limited difference in the spring offensive, but not with the type of tank that the Germans decided to produce at the time. The big A7Vs, the 18-man, slow, giant, armored tortoise thing, that's not going to do much. If the Germans, for example, had created something like the French had done, the FT-17, their fast two-man tanks with a traversable turret, and you could see them in amongst the spring offensive, bringing up guns once the leading stormtrooper units had outrun their own gun lines. That might have been a different story. Maybe those breakthroughs would have reached Amiens. Maybe that would have changed things. But it would have had to have been started way earlier. It would have had to been a dedicated look at a brand new style of tank, and it would have had to been in significant numbers. And of course, the training would have had to have been done to integrate them within the infantry and so on and so forth. So it's really quite pie in the sky, that. But I think the A7Vs, I think all dozen or so that are actually used in action, they're a showpiece, a bit of a propaganda piece. They're not up to much. The first one gets knocked out, I think, in Villers-Bretonneux by two mail tanks, two British mail Mark IVs. It's not really a big deal at that stage in the war. But an interesting topic to cover, actually. And I'm going to go straight into another question for you, Spence, here from Benjamin Deutsch here, who mentions Crimean War, American Civil War, Boer War, and Russo-Japanese War. And his comment and question is the following. I was wondering, to what extent did military planners on either side factor in these conflicts, if they even recognized them as something worth studying, and if those lessons were ever applied in the early stages of the First World War?
Oh, big question that has drawn entire books about this. I've written one called From Boer War to World War, which is about how the British tried to learn from the Boer War. There's other books of a similar ilk. I might mention my former PhD student's book, From Bull Run to Boer War by Michael Somerville. He's took the story really from the American Civil War to the Boer War, almost a prequel to my own From Boer War to World War. And there's also been books and studies done on the Russia-Japanese War as well. And the short answer, Benjamin, is yes, all armies studied these wars to a greater or lesser extent. So the Crimean War really took place so long ago with relatively limited technology, it wasn't really that influential. The American Civil War was very influential on the British military, much less so on European militaries, it must be said. And the reason it was less influential there is because the Franco-Prussian War and the Prusso-Austrian War both take place just a few years after the Civil Wars ended, and these seem much more immediate, and there's a lot more to learn than what's going on in America. But the British are actually fascinated by the American Civil War. There's a fear that Britain will actually end up fighting the Americans in Canada at some future point. Of course, Britain considers at various points intervening in the American Civil War, so studying the war is really interesting. And then in the aftermath, in the decades that follow, the British Army considers, it looks at how the Confederacy held off the Union for so long, 4 years of intense fighting, even though the Confederacy is always outnumbered, much smaller economy. How's that possible? And in some respects, the British Army's interest is the British Army knows it's always going to be smaller than a European army, whether that's the French, the Russians, or the Germans. And so the example of this small army, the Confederacy, that seems to have a qualitative advantage over a much larger industrialized army, that's very interesting for the British Army to study. Can we learn anything from this? Could we try and replicate the Confederacy in battle? Of course, the long-term implication of that is you're going to lose because the Confederacy is crushed at the end. But in army terms, that's very interesting. The big one, though, for the British is the Boer War. And as I say, I've written on this, as well as the book. I've written all kinds of articles about this. And the Boer War completely revolutionizes the British Army. It revolutionizes it organizationally in terms of equipment and in terms of tactics. It's a huge topic. It also crucially changes the way the army thinks as well. The army goes from, I wouldn't say completely old-fashioned, because it's not completely old-fashioned, but it definitely starts to reform with a real sense of urgency. There's a lot more emphasis on professionalism, quality, limited by that age-old bugbear of all British armies, the lack of financing, but there's a real emphasis on, hey, we've got to get ready because we can't have this happen again. And I've written and indeed said that the period after the Boer War, its 12-year period, 1902 to 1914, is one of the most successful peacetime reforms the British Army has ever had in a relatively short period of time. And in some ways, the tragedy for the British Army is the war comes a little bit too quickly. If the war broken out 4 years later, I think the British Army would have been even stronger. But I'm sure all armies would say that. And the final one, the Russo-Japanese War, this is heavily studied by all the European powers. Britain sends more observers to the Russo-Japanese War than any previous war, not least because Britain is allied to Japan. And alongside that, the French send dozens of observers to the Russian side because France and Russia are allies, and the Germans send as many observers as they can. The Russo-Japanese War is a confusing one because it's often said, oh, this is a precursor to the First World War. I've heard it described as World War Zero, which is a great term, but it's not an accurate term at all. Number of factors make the Russo-Japanese War really bizarre to European observers' eyes. It's fought in an incredibly underdeveloped area, what is now effectively North Korea and part of northeastern China. Almost no development there, no rail, very, very limited roads. The weather's poor. It's basically impossible to campaign there in the winter. Very mountainous, very difficult terrain. And you've got a Russian army that is by no means the cream of the Russian army against a Japanese force that's a total unknown quantity. And so on land, there seems to be lessons here. The cost of assaulting fortified positions, the Japanese assault at Port Arthur is very bloody. The Battle of Mukden, which ends the war, is extremely bloody and involves a lot of trench warfare. That seems to be a lesson. But even though Japanese assaults at Port Arthur and Mukden and other battles are costly, the Japanese win. They actually break the trenches. They overrun the Russian positions. And so the lessons are not are ambiguous. They're not unambiguous. Observers look at them, and there's all kinds of debate about what does this mean? What is the implication? On one hand, it's going to be very bloody to assault fixed positions, but on the other hand, the attacker can capture them and press on. And so European armies draw all sorts of different lessons from the Russo-Japanese War. It's not as clear-cut, perhaps, as it seems now with hindsight to people living at the time. And so a lot of intellectual energy is spent on studying these wars, but none of them are a perfect match for what happens in the First World War. There's good lessons to be learned from them, and I think armies really try and do this, but then the First World War is a different challenge entirely. I'll end by saying one thing, though, and that's in the British Army, one of the things that comes out of the Boer War is the British Army's first modern doctrine, Field Service Regulations 1909. And the British Army will use variations of Field Service Regulations in World War I and World War II, and a little bit into the Cold War as well. The very fact that that emerges from the Boer War, I think, tells you about how much that war was studied and how influential it was. It effectively creates the doctrine the British Army will use in 2 world wars. And ultimately, the British Army, with its allies, is victorious in those wars. So the lessons weren't completely ignored. That was a very long answer, Dan, but it's a question that I could talk for an entire episode on. So have you got any thoughts on that, or shall I pick another one out the hat for you?
Well, I mean, just briefly, I think we definitely need to throw the Franco-Prussian War into the mix here. I think it's the elephant in the room as far as both Germany and France are concerned. Obviously, it's within living memory. It's not within fighting memory, as far as I'm aware. I don't know of anybody that's stretched from 1870 to 1914. Just that little bit too long. But it's certainly within living memory. And let's be fair, the French took a fair pasting in the Franco-Prussian War. So they're desperate to learn lessons. Ironically, some of those key lessons are not learned in the Franco-Prussian War. They're not learned in the First World War. And they're not learned in the Second World War either. Something like the enemy is not going to attack through the Ardennes. That old chestnut that we've heard once or twice, and the importance of the Meuse River on the eastern bank of France, around France and Germany. That same area is going to become a battlefield, as we know repeatedly. In fact, Sedan itself, that town, is going to be the heart of the fighting in the Franco-Prussian War. Big part of the fighting in the 1914 period of the First World War, and again in 1918 when the Americans cross it during the 100 Days, and then, of course, in the Second World War. So we are going to see the same fighting over the same ground. So even if we just talk about the topography of lessons learned, that's interesting in itself, and perhaps a future podcast episode. But since we're on that part of the front, Spence, and I don't know whether this is one for you or for me, but we're down in the kind of southeastern part of the of the Western Front, not quite southeastern, but certainly eastern anyway, down towards the lesser known end, at least from Western eyes of the battlefields. There's that regular question that comes up with regards to the idea of the two ends of the Western Front, and I hear this quite a lot. People will always ask, "What are the ends of the Western Front like?" Now, I don't know how well you know these. I suspect you got a little bit more knowledge on the northern end, the end that ends in the English Channel. Is this one for you or one for me?
Well, if I take the northern end and you take the southern end of the Western Front, I think we can we can somewhere meet in the middle.
Let's do that. Let's do that.
This is a question we get a lot, and in fact, we've had it multiple times in various forms. So if you've centered this one in, we finally got round to it. And the short answer is, in the north, in actual fact, the defences go right up to the coast. Now, that doesn't mean you've got a trench on the beach, because that's very impractical to dig a trench in sand. But what you do have is a mass of barbed wire, which is as good as having a trench there. In fact, it's better. You have masses and masses of barbed wire put across the beaches by both the Germans and the British and the Belgians who are up there as well, to stop anybody moving. And bombarding that, it's obvious you're going to be trying to attack across the beach. And it's very narrow. Nobody wants to attack laterally across a beach. And in fact, there's a quote I've got here by Charles Dewey from the 1st Dorsets, who's describing Newport up on the northern end of the Western Front, and he remembered, "Newport was not greatly different from other towns lying in the near vicinity of the front line. Newport Bains, a summer resort lying at the mouth of the Yser and adorned by the usual grimcrack villas, was levelled nearly to the ground. War seemed more than usually odd as one sat in some convenient fold of the dunes and watched the waves lapping belts of wire on the shore and the play of machine guns over the sands, where but a short while before men and women had kept holiday and children had built sand castles." So this was a strange end of the Western Front. And it wasn't actually devoid of action, because in 1917, as part of the looming Third Ypres offensive, the British were considering, or would have liked to, expanded a salient that they actually possessed very close to the north end, that they were going to use as a bit of a jumping off point to try and undermine the German defences to the north. The Germans preempted it and actually attacked the build-up of British forces here much sooner. And I owe all this information to my friend, colleague, and fellow author, Dr. Michael Cicero, who's currently writing a book about this operation. And the Germans attacked in what they called Operation Strandfest, which I'm assured it actually means a beach party, which gives you some idea about where this battle was taking place, effectively amongst sandy scrub dunes of this region. And it was a complete success for the Germans. They drove in the British lodgement in their lines and basically kicked the British out of this area. So it wasn't completely devoid of fighting, but it was pretty windswept. You were exposed to a lot of sea wind blowing in from there. I suppose you were spared the worst of the fighting. You'd probably rather be on the north end of the front than you would be on the Ypres front, but it wasn't without its violence. But I think Charles Dewey's description there just captures some of the surrealism. You're fighting in what was effectively a holiday resort here. And a point we're often asked, did the trenches go right up to the sea? Well, they didn't, but the defences did. You had masses of barbed wire lying in the sea, just slowly rusting and corroding under the seawater. So that's what the northern end looked like. But Dan, what about down on the Swiss border? What's going on down there?
Well, it's interesting how you describe that, actually, because I can draw some comparisons. There's almost a romantic kind of scene you hear from what Dewey was saying there. And there's an element of that as well when you look at the other end of the Western Front, sometimes called the South, more reasonably the Eastern end. But it's the same kind of thing, except there are a few key points where that story is very different. Of course, the terrain itself and the topography is very different. We're effectively ending on the Swiss border here. Well, not even effectively, literally ending on the Swiss border. And it's almost an alpine part of the world down towards Mulhouse. And it's a beautiful area, kind of pine trees mixed with rolling hills, and then dotted with concrete bunkers, which really are the only signs left of the fighting in that part of the war. But in effect, it's almost comical in a sense as well, because you get trenches extending all the way down towards the Swiss border. You get to the Swiss border, and there's a barbed wire fence, and it's a little sign saying this is Switzerland. And the war stops there. And in the field next door, there's a Swiss bloke ploughing a field and digging up his turnips, and nobody touches it. It's almost comical in a sense, because both sides also have all sides, we should say, have a vested interest in Switzerland. Switzerland is used as a place to repatriate wounded soldiers. Wounded Brits are getting flown back or getting travelled back through neutral Switzerland, even during the war. Happens again in the Second World War. But if I could try and draw a picture of what the very end of the Western Front looks like, it's a location known as Kilometre Zero. You can quite literally look at the German and the French pillboxes and bunker positions that have been established from the 14 to 18 period right down to the Swiss border. And it's slightly odd because there's a bit of Switzerland that sticks out. And so there are effectively two areas where you can argue the end of the Western Front is. But we've got a concrete bunker on one side, about 80 yards away. You've got another concrete bunker. They're facing each other. And then facing in between them, looking straight up the 400 odd mile length of the Western Front, is a wooden Swiss blockhouse made of wood, no real protection to speak of, and it's looking straight up between these two blockhouses, which are literally the end of the Western Front. It's a really surreal location, and in fact, really from the end of 1914 onwards, very, very quiet. There's next to no action there. There's the odd bit of sniping. Generally, it's one of those areas that we refer to as live and let live. 1914, during the Battle of Frontiers, there's a very vicious fight that goes on for a short period of time in that area. But after that, the Western Front really settles down. And this is certainly something we'll have to come back to in the future because, one, we've totally underrepresented the French, who are by far the biggest player, by far the most important of the Western Allies, and do most of the fighting and most of the dying in the Great War. And it's a big gap that we need to address. But secondly, also, there's not fighting by any stretch all along that entire area of the Western Front. It's simply impossible. It's a huge area. French typically hold 8 or 9/10 of the entire Western Front. And you get areas where the front lines are perhaps almost a mile apart, and you might get 20 guys holding a 500-yard stretch on both sides. So you do get very quiet sectors where neither side really wants to shoot at each other. You come to the idea, look, you don't shoot at us, we won't shoot at you. We'll try and pass the war fairly peacefully in this area. And that's really what we find around Kilometre Zero from late 1914 onwards. It's if you were to compare that with Verdun or with the Ypres salient, it is absolutely poles apart. You still see the same guys in the same uniform fighting, but it could not be much different. And actually, I'd recommend any of you guys listening, if you do get a chance, it's a beautiful part of the world to go to. Head down to Kilometre Zero. Try and find that Swiss blockhouse, which proverbially looks up the entire length of the Western Front. It's a remarkable area, and I think an interesting contrast, Spence, to what you've just mentioned there. Which brings me on to a question for you, actually, because we've been talking battlefields, and of course it's a regular topic on this podcast for obvious reasons. I'd love to know, actually, what's your favourite battlefield to go to?
No, difficult question, but I can give a pretty confident answer. And my favourite battlefield is actually Le Cateau, and there's a few reasons why that is. One, it is a crucial battle for the British Army and by extension the Allies in the First World War. Secondly, I don't think that many people really visit it. It tends to be one that you pass by. The battlefields of 1914 are not widely visited in general, and Le Cateau is one of those. But I think the real reason is it's a really unusual First World War battlefield because it's very little changed. There's more traffic goes along the roads now, but largely it is not urbanized. Le Cateau is bigger than it was in the First World War. There's some of the little villages that were just really farming hamlets have expanded a little bit, but not much. And it is a battle that you can understand and you can tour and experience and learn about on the ground, and you don't need to try and picture in your head. And this whole area was covered with trenches and barbed wire. It's much more like a Napoleonic or an American Civil War battlefield instead, where armies are maneuvering out in the open, and it's a big battlefield, and extends several miles. Unless you're going to really hike it, you really need to jump in cars to go to different parts of it. But I think it's really, really fascinating, and you can tell such a great story because the ground hasn't really changed. You can get a really good feel for what it would have looked like in 1914, especially on quiet days, because although there's more road traffic there than there used to be, it's not a particularly busy area. You can stand down at the sunken lane where the British had their gun position and look out, and you can imagine as the veterans remembered that the Germans came over the hills in front of them and were skylined as they crested this hill and were hit by fire. You can go over to the hill on the right flank where the Second Corps Memorial is, which is known to battlefield guides as Suffolk Hill. Wasn't known as Suffolk Hill at the time, but this is how battlefields can sometimes change their names. And you can stand on this position, which was occupied by the Suffolks. They were basically blown to pieces by incoming German fire. And you can look across and you can actually see, with the naked eye, or even better with binoculars, you can see where the Germans had their artillery positioned. It's somewhere in the region about 4,000 yards away. So I think Okato is a great battlefield. It's got lots of fascinating little wrinkles to it as well, smaller actions. You can zoom in on, say, Bernard Montgomery, who is just a lieutenant at the battle. He goes forward on the left flank, waving his sword in his air, as he remembered, and he tripped over his own scabbard and fell on the floor. And it probably saved him because his company was badly shot up in the fighting. If he hadn't fallen over right at the start, he might have been mown down. Or you can look at the big picture stuff as well and consider the big maneuvers. I think it's a great battlefield. It's one that really repays a visit, and it's one where usually you've got the place to yourself as well. So off the top of my head, that's my favourite battlefield, Dan. One of many, of course, but there's my special pleading. What about you, Dan? Where's your favourite?
Well, I have a bit of a wry smile when you mention Locato and Suffolk Hill particularly. Fascinating battlefield, love it. Blighted by me getting my car stuck on Suffolk Hill once when I tried to drive up to the memorial. So word of warning, if you try and drive up to that memorial, particularly in poor weather, not a great idea. It's best done on foot, but it is a fascinating part of the world to visit. Mine, I'm gonna go for the French sector actually, and I'm specifically gonna go for a place called the Butte de Vauquois, which is really on the left bank of the Verdun salient, for lack of a better word. It's the site of a village which was really a hilltop village pre-war, which is absolutely annihilated during the fighting. Not a single brick standing on top of another by the time it's actually liberated by the Americans. In late 1918 during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, but it is absolutely annihilated. Not only is the trenches still preserved there on both sides, you can still see enormous mining divots taken out of the ground. There are miles and miles of tunnels beneath the battlefields. It's like somebody just said, right, war's over, lads, let's all go home, and they left that battlefield absolutely untouched. So in terms of places to go and to really understand, one, how close the trenches were in certain locations, secondly, how vicious the fighting is, and thirdly, just what it really looked like. You know, this is about as immersive as an experience as you can get and going to the battlefield. So many that I would choose from, many in the British sector, of course. Big fan of 1915, which is, I think, quite unsung in terms of being a fairly flat and not particularly attractive part of northern France, but still very important. The Butte de Vauquois, for me, has really got something special about it. And you go there and it's got a real wow factor. So I would say that one's mine. And I'm also going to use this opportunity, Spence, to segue into what we're doing next year, because I knew we wanted to plug it somewhere, and it's come to me that this is actually a great spot. So, because we're going to be going there next year in our tour that we're running. So, for those of you that are not aware so far, Spencer and I are going to be leading a guided battlefield tour next year on the ground in France. It's going to be covering the American contribution. So it's going to be the Doughboys at War Tour. And it's going to run from the 3rd to the 8th of June, 2025. And it's going to cover all of the major American battlefields, including a few little jaunts into those areas like the Butte de Vauquois, which are just unmissable for anybody in that part of the world. And I'm also reliably informed it's basically sold out. So if you've been thinking about, I'd quite like to go, I'd quite like to do it, now is your time. Follow the link in the description, drop us a quick message, come and join us on the battlefields, meet us in the bar for a beer afterwards, and talk history with hopefully a big group of other listeners who love this subject too. So Spence, that's going to be a really good one. I think something that we can really look forward to for next year. I love being on the ground. I know you do too.
I absolutely, and I think one of the best things to really do is have a bit more of an extended tour like we're offering. And I know many of us, we're all busy. We probably love to spend more time touring battlefields and history sites than we get to. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with a weekend or even a couple of days out on the battlefields. But there's something special about when you do a more extended tour, as we're going to do, because you'll see the progression of the the American Expeditionary Force, effectively, from a brave and ultimately successful assault into Belleau Wood to a much more sophisticated set of battles by the time of Meuse-Argonne. You effectively get to see the American Army's learning curve on the ground. And also, because we're together for a longer time, I think one of the real joys of battlefield tours is the great spirit of friendship that you generate on these tours. There is a mood, I think, on a good battlefield tour, and this will be not just a good battlefield tour, it's going to be a great battlefield tour. There's a mood that develops. Your friendships develop, camaraderie develops, little bits of humor and running jokes develop. And, for a moment in those tours, you can almost imagine that as you're trumping along on a rainy battlefield, because of course rain's always a hazard on the battlefield, and sharing a few jokes, sharing a little bit of wisecracking and so on, you capture, I think, a little bit of an element of what many soldiers marching to and from the front would have gone through. Just that camaraderie is a really unsung element, and the longer you're on the tour for, the more you can develop it. So it's going to be a great experience for history. Come for the history, stay for the friendship would be my tagline for it. But as you say, Dan, we are basically sold out. So if you've been thinking about it, act now. There will be a reserve list for if you can't. All the places are gone and somebody drops out, but you do need to act pretty quickly. We're effectively out of, I think, 1 or 2 spaces left, so we're really, really short on that. So if you're thinking about it, strike while the iron is hot.
Excellent. And if for nothing else, you can come along and hear Spencer butcher French town and village names. So that's always worth a look as well. Well, that brings us, Spence, to the end of this anniversary. Can't believe it. Anniversary podcast episode, which has been, time has just flown. And I'll just reiterate what was said at the start. Thank you guys so much for coming along and listening to us, and for all the interaction. We love these these Q&A sessions are amongst my very favorite. That was a question that we did have. What is your favorite episode? I'm gonna quickly answer this. My favorite episodes are these ones, actually. I really like the diversity of the Q&A ones. I also like stuff like barbed wire. I thought that was pretty cool, pretty niche, quite geeky. I'm into that. What about you, Spence?
I would agree with you. I think the listeners' questions are great fun. And one, because there's just such variety. And secondly, because we don't really do any prep work for it. So, we listeners, we have a very simple Google document that we work from with some questions on it, and we just go through them. And so it's a good test of our knowledge as well, but it really makes you think. There's a lot of imagination in this. Again, shout out to the barbed wire episode, which I think we originally envisaged as a joke, and yet went on to be one of our most popular episodes. And the love for the sort of the niche elements, which are actually incredibly important, is apparent from our listenership. An episode that I always thought was extremely strong was our episode on the missing, which we were really keen, I remember, Dan, at the time, to really get this one right and get the mood right and so on. And feedback we had on that episode was really powerful. It was quite meaningful to know that we'd actually touch people who had relatives who were missing in the First World War, even a century on, and that was very touching. I really enjoyed, too, our dives onto the battlefield. So we covered some British battles, we've covered some Australian battles, covered American battles, lots more to cover. I'll be absolutely honest, Dan, I don't think we'd have made it to a year's worth of episodes if we didn't enjoy all the episodes to a greater or lesser extent. And listeners, I hope you can really get that impression. We really enjoy what we're doing. I'm personally delighted that listeners, you enjoy what we're doing too, because if we're not enjoying it, if we're not having fun with it, as well as educating, well, what's the point in doing it?
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Well, hi, Dan. A really special episode this week because, incredibly, our project that seemed just an amateur bit of fun. No, I'm not going to say amateur because that sounds terrible. We're professionals, damn it. Good start. There's an outtake for you, Linus.
Yeah, nice.